They smelled the night before they saw it, a hot, animal scent that clung to canvas and canvas tents, the diesel tang of generators, the sweet rot of jungle leaves underfoot. It was late 1944, somewhere in the Pacific Theater, where an island became a world of its own, a cramped, salt-stiffed camp of men who had been fighting for months, whose sleep was measured in 10-minute fragments, whose nerves had been sharpened by the small, constant violences of combat. Floodlights cut like searchlights across puddled sand and rows of makeshift pens. The guards moved in pairs beneath the glare. The captives were kept at a distance, grouped, catalogued, shielded from the curious and the furious alike. In that light, the unit saw what it had not seen for months: a woman among the captives. She was young, small, wrapped in a threadbare garment, eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the language barrier. For soldiers who had been trained to expect male opponents and to think of prisoners as either combatants or civilians, her presence was an anomaly that carried weight beyond its immediate facts. It meant a cultural dissonance. Surrender, in many Japanese minds, was unthinkable. To be captured was a humiliation wrapped in shame. For the American unit, already operating on exhaustion and improvisation, it meant a new set of obligations and uncertainties that no field manual could fully anticipate. What happened next would test the moral fabric of that unit. There is a quality to late 1944 island warfare that documentaries and textbooks compress into statistics. Heavy rain or crippling dust, radios that crackled with static, supply tracers that came and went on the mercy of a chain stretched across the ocean. In practice, the doctrine on prisoners was straightforward. The United States had accepted the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. In the field, commanders were charged with safeguarding captives and maintaining order until proper processing and transfer could take place. But doctrine meets the unpredictable. The men who enforced that doctrine were young, tired, sometimes local replacements with a handful of weeks in theater, sometimes seasoned non-commissioned officers who carried the slow burn of fatigue under their eyes. In that volatile mix, a single human interaction could escalate in ways that books could not predict. The woman had been brought in after a skirmish that had left the island's perimeter contested. She was not a figure of strategic importance. She was, in the precise terms later used in reports, a rare female detainee in a theater where most captives were men. Her health was described as fragile in the immediate notes. She was frightened, dehydrated, and tightly clinging to whatever small dignity she could maintain. For the American unit, already operating on exhaustion and improvisation, it meant a new set of obligations and uncertainties that no field manual could fully anticipate. What happened next would test the moral fabric of that unit. Army medics moved her to a makeshift aid station, and then, in accordance with orders that sought to balance expediency and care, to a more secure infirmary under the watch of nurses and designated guards. For the men who watched, the sight of her, and the responsibility that accompanied it, was an unaccustomed moral obligation in the middle of war. The man who crossed the line was not, by the standards of his unit, an outcast. He was described in the available accounts as young, decorated for previous actions, competent in combat, and with a service record that suggested steadiness rather than deviance. He was, however, a man who carried the cumulative weight of long marches, sleepless nights, and a string of losses whose names became only numbers by the time they were spoken. In testimony recorded shortly afterward, colleagues described him as someone whose hands had steadied a mortar crew, whose marksmanship had drawn praise. But the same testimony, spoken in hushed tones and later conscientious phrases in official notes, also recorded the sort of exhaustion that makes professional boundaries fragile. On a humid evening, under a wash of imperfect light, he approached the enclosure where the woman was held. The moment was a few seconds long, and, even as witnesses later tried to reconstruct it, those seconds refused to reveal everything. Men who saw him later used words like intrusive and inappropriate. Others spoke of a brief physical act that crossed an inviolable boundary, a violation not only of military rules but of human trust. The accounts are consistent in one particular. The action did not last long. It was over in a breath. Yet, even a breath can leave a wound. Witnesses did not react with screams. They froze. That silence is significant. In a place where sudden movement could mean ambush, where caution is a muscle trained into the body of every soldier, a hesitation is often the first reaction. Several guards who later gave statements to investigators said they watched, momentarily unsure whether the scene was sanctioned or chaotic. A couple of them moved in quickly, an instinct for order overcoming the shock. Others later admitted to the discomfort that had pinned them, the difficulty of intervening in a moment that felt private yet was unquestionably public conduct in a custodial space. The prisoner, as subsequent medical notes emphasize with the terse compassion of field entries, was removed from proximity to the soldier and given immediate care. Nurses recorded the event in practical terms. She was transferred to the infirmary. Her wounds, emotional as well as physical, were noted in the shorthand of wartime medicine. She was placed under safer supervision and, crucially, away from the immediate presence of the men who had witnessed the incident. The duty to protect the weak in custody, a principle underscored in military doctrine, came into force. Command was notified quickly. That phrase, "command was notified quickly," matters because it is one of the first answers to the question many modern observers will ask: was this hushed up? In the messy fog of an island campaign, with supply lines thin and reputations fragile, the impulse to conceal can be strong. In this case, the report trails left in the wake of the incident and met the higher ranks within hours. A non-commissioned officer made an initial entry. An officer on duty recorded a terse description. The division's chain was engaged. What followed was not theatrical inevitability nor clandestine dismissal. It was the activation of a procedural mechanism that had been largely designed for order, not for moral catharsis. Still, context complicates accountability. The soldier who committed the act, again unnamed in the records available to us and here referred to only as a young U.S. soldier, had a prior history that complicated how his superiors saw the incident. He had been decorated for actions that, in the field, were sometimes decisions between survival and sacrifice. His peers spoke of him with a mix of admiration and tired affection. These were not excuses, they were part of the calculus that commanders had to consider when they weighed charges. Was he a malicious offender? The testimonies that would form the bulk of a field investigation later emphasize the absence of an established pattern of predatory behavior. There was, instead, the weight of accumulated combat stress pressing on a single momentary lapse. How do you measure a lapse? The military justice system in a forward area is both practical and political. There are thresholds of misconduct that demand immediate court-martial. There are lesser breaches that call for administrative discipline. There are gray areas where commanders weigh factors that include unit cohesion, the mental state of the accused, the plausibility of rehabilitation, and the danger of resentment among the ranks. In the field, leaders often had to adjudicate with limited information while balancing the need to maintain morale and the credibility of command. The question then was not just whether an offense had occurred, the witness statements make clear that it did, but what mechanism of accountability would best serve both justice and operational necessity. The first responses were practical and immediate. The soldier was removed from his post and placed under guard. His weapon and any authority associated with his position were temporarily suspended. These measures were recorded in field entries that avoided melodrama, adhering instead to a bureaucratic vocabulary: removed from duty, temporary confinement, notification of superiors. Simultaneously, medics and nurses ensured the prisoner received care. The camp's medical personnel, who had seen the worst of wounds, both open and concealed, treated the woman with the scarce privacy that a makeshift infirmary could offer. Their notes contain a tone of professional concern: dehydration, shock, need for observation, referral to a safer custody location. The medical response was, in the words later appearing in after-action reviews, prompt and appropriate. There was, in those early hours, a sense among some soldiers that the matter could be resolved quietly. Rumors moved through the tents like a second tide. Whisperings about the soldier's decorations, about his temperament, about whether a man who had held a squad together under fire should face public ruin for a brief, regrettable act. Throughout histories of wartime conduct, one recurrent temptation appears: to privilege battlefield contribution over civilian sensibilities. In this instance, however, the chain of command did not simply permit quiet discretion. The first sergeant and the on-duty lieutenant recognized the need to elevate the matter for formal consideration. So the process moved beyond the immediate camp. Investigators were informed, and an informal fact-finding began. Witnesses were quietly isolated, their statements recorded one by one. Those interviews were the core of the process, in a forward area where physical evidence could be scant and human testimony would carry heavy weight. The men who spoke later, some in formal notes, some in letters, some in memoir fragments published years after the war, remember the interviews as serious, methodical, and constrained by the conditions of the theater. They spoke of officers who listened without obvious bias, who asked the same questions in variations, who seemed determined to reconstruct a sequence rather than to prosecute a moral narrative. Yet even the interviews showed the problem of certainty in war. Memories blurred under stress, timescales compressed, small actions assumed outsized meaning. Some witnesses emphasized the soldier's abruptness and the woman's startled recoil. Others focused on the brevity of the incident. A common refrain across multiple statements was the same paradox. The action was brief, almost casual in the moment, yet its implications were severe. The reports show an awareness among the interviewing officers of this paradox. It was over in seconds, one field memo would later summarize in its dispassionate way, and yet it requires full consideration given the captive's vulnerability. The man's own account, and here the record is unusually direct, was a mixture of admission and contextualization. According to the note taken by an investigating officer, he acknowledged the action. He did not deny that it occurred. At the same time, he framed it in the milieu of exhaustion and a loss of professional boundaries. That acknowledgement was a critical datum for the command, a voluntary admission that reduced uncertainty about whether the event had occurred, even as it complicated the question of motive. Admission in military proceedings is not the same as guilt adjudicated by a court. It is, however, a pragmatic factor that commanders could not ignore. What is striking at this point is how the unit's response began to split into two related but distinct imperatives. One was the immediate moral and legal question: what should happen to the soldier who had transgressed the custodial duty? The other was a forward-looking operational requirement: how to prevent such an incident from occurring again. Even in the chaos of late 1944 operations, some leaders saw these questions as inseparable. Discipline without reform would be cosmetic. Reform without accountability would be hollow. Those debates, however, had to take place through the comparatively slow medium of military procedure. The chain of command convened an on-site deliberative body, a field board, sometimes referred to in the sparse notes as a board of inquiry or investigating officers panel. The specifics of composition and authority for that board in this case are recorded only partially in the surviving entries, and where the records do not specify, we mark them indefinito. What is clear is that the board's mandate was to reconstruct the event, evaluate the evidence, and recommend a course of action. It was not a criminal court in full form. It was an instrument of immediate, theater-level decision-making that would determine whether the matter should escalate to a court-martial or be resolved administratively. The convening of that board itself served as a public notice within the unit. Leadership would not ignore such breaches. That alone had moral force. For men who had survived together, the visible engagement of authority communicated that standards still mattered. For the prisoner, who by the time of these deliberations had been moved to more secure medical custody, the board signaled that the military recognized both the wrong and its obligation to address it.
For the soldier, it meant that his peers' earlier admiration would be re-examined under the less forgiving lens of institutional review. The interviews expanded in the next hours to include not only immediate eyewitnesses, but the nurses and medics who had treated the woman. Their testimony introduced a professional perspective, a clinical observation about injuries or stress responses, an appraisal of the woman's capacity to give coherent statements, a note on her need for privacy. Those medical voices, sometimes overlooked in battlefield narratives, played a crucial role. They reframed the event not merely as an infraction against regulation, but as a matter touching the health and safety of a vulnerable person under American care. That reframing would later influence how the board weighed its options. Commanders also had to contend with the soldier's prior record.
They did not treat his decorations as absolution. Rather, they examined them as part of their assessment of character and the impact of sustained combat on judgment. Letters from men who served with him later characterize a complexity. A competent, brave soldier who also showed signs of being close to the brink of fatigue. These testimonies did not erase responsibility. Instead, they complicated it, producing an ethical question as old as military command itself. How to reconcile a man's battlefield usefulness with his breach of basic custodial duty. Meanwhile, whispers of the event had already begun to circulate beyond the immediate circle. Rumors, as they do, blurred facts into speculation. Some versions of the story suggested a cover-up. Others imagined a severe public spectacle intended to make an example of the man. Both extremes oversimplify the reality recorded in the board's preparatory notes. What emerges from those notes is not dramatic theater, but a disciplined attempt to calibrate punishment and prevention. At the same time, practical reforms began to be sketched in the margins of reports. A non-commissioned officer, tasked with drafting immediate recommendations, noted the need for paired guard assignments for those guarding female detainees, stricter rotation schedules to prevent a single soldier's prolonged exposure to stress, and more explicit training on the handling of female prisoners in field conditions. These were not reactive bureaucratic gestures. They were operational fixes aimed at reducing future incidents. The board would later formalize some of these reforms, but even at this preliminary stage, there is evidence of a unit that sought to turn a breach into a lesson. Through the fog of that first night and the next day, the personnel responsible for discipline weighed options that, in a garrison, might have been more elaborate. The field board could recommend a court-martial, a full judicial process that would, if pursued, have required more extensive documentation, potential transfer to a rear echelon for trial, and a public airing that the command might have feared would demoralize men already frayed by combat. Alternatively, the board could recommend administrative punishment, reprimand, temporary confinement, reduction of rank, or other measures that addressed guilt without creating the logistical and reputational burden of a full court-martial. The commander's calculus included considerations of expediency, fairness, and the message that any chosen punishment would send to both the unit and to the wider theater. As testimony arrived and the board's members conferred, the tone of the deliberations can be inferred from the careful, sometimes halting language of the minutes. The officers were not conducting a public inquisition. Their work was procedural and, by the phrasing in those notes, intent on measured judgment.
We must decide what best serves justice and operational effectiveness, one line reads in the sparse minutes. The phrasing is measured, but it carries urgency. In a forward environment, the outcome of such decisions is not merely about one man's fate. It is about the integrity and discipline of a fighting force. Even as the board moved toward a recommendation, the human consequences of the event remained immediate. Among the men, there was discomfort that extended beyond any single decision. Some soldiers who had served alongside the accused found themselves reinterpreting past actions. Others feared that a lenient outcome would signal tolerance for exploitation. For the woman who had been held, the outcome mattered in a personal sense, though the records make clear that her immediate needs were being tended to. A quiet bed, careful observation, the presence of women medical staff where possible. The field's moral balance had to account for her vulnerability as much as for the soldiers' prior service. The tension in the camp was not simply about punishment, it was also about example. Which value would the command want to accentuate? The instinct to protect reputation and preserve effective fighting units? Or the need to demonstrate that custodial duty and humane behavior remained core to the military's ethical framework even amid the worst conditions of war? It was in this crucible that the board prepared to make a choice that, as later documents would suggest, sought to harmonize both imperatives rather than sacrifice one for the other. What followed from that point would not be a dramatic courtroom spectacle in the rear areas, nor would it be a private, muffled dismissal. The trajectory chosen by the board and the command balanced discipline with preventive reform. But that conclusion belongs to the next passage of this account. At this moment, the scene is still unfolding. Investigators have collected statements. Nurses continue to monitor a frightened prisoner. The soldier is under guard, and the board is assembling its recommendation. Men who had fought together now watched as institutional processes took over. Processes that, in hours and days, would decide whether this brief, terrible moment would be met with public retribution, private administrative censure, or a hybrid approach that attempted to preserve both justice and efficacy. And yet, even as the procedural machinery activated, the human weight of the incident lingered in quieter corners. In the mess tent, a corporal folded a letter from home and thought of the thin lines between duty and lapse. In the infirmary, a nurse made a note about watchfulness and added a small personal sentence: ensure privacy. In the office where the board convened, an officer circled possible reforms on a scrap of paper: pair guarding, rotation schedules, specific instruction about female detainees.
Those small, practical annotations would come to matter as much as any formal pronouncement. But for those present, the moral question was immediate. Could a military institution in the field both hold an individual accountable and also learn from the failure? The answer would determine not only the soldier's fate, but the standard the unit would set for itself in the months still to come. The lines of inquiry extended beyond this single island, touching on how an army fights honorably while under the terrible pressure of war. The board's recommendation would ripple outward, a calibration of justice that would either reassure men that standards were enforceable or leave them to wonder whether their own conduct might be judged differently tomorrow than it was today. The men who had witnessed the seconds-long event returned to their duties with that moral work still unresolved. They continued to patrol, to sleep in short segments, to sharpen their rifles and their nerves. But in the back of more than a few minds there remained an image not meant for a battlefield: a frightened woman under watch, a man who had failed a basic custodial trust, and a command convening to decide not merely a penalty but the nature of its own rules. The field board would begin its formal assessment in the morning. Officers would consult with legal advisors whose names in the surviving notes are indefinito. The possible penalties would be discussed with a seriousness that balanced the immediacy of war with the permanence of moral judgment. The end of the night brought no neat resolution. It brought instead a heavier silence, the kind that follows an event too important to be dismissed and too delicate to be solved with quick ritual. The soldiers slept under an observation watch, the prisoner in a guarded infirmary, and the unit waited for the machinery of command to translate fragments of testimony into a path forward. What made that waiting fraught was not only the question of punishment, it was the question of whether the institution would choose a path that affirmed both discipline and humane treatment, or whether it would opt for a response that, however expedient, left deeper problems unaddressed. In the pre-dawn hours, as rain began to mist through the canvas and generators hummed their small, persistent thrum, a junior officer printed fresh copies of the witness statements. Nurses completed their charts. An adjutant prepared a note to higher command, marking the matter for immediate attention.
The field board, the practical instrument of the theater's justice system, readied to deliberate. The single thread that tied these separate actions together was the recognition that what had happened, for all its brevity, demanded a response calibrated to both law and conscience. Beyond the immediate scene, the broader context remained. The Pacific Campaign pressed on with the indifferent pressure of strategic necessity. Ships delivered supplies and took bodies away.
Policies would be reviewed, and in time, recommendations might filter into manuals or memos that reassigned guard pairings and clarified training on female detainees. Those future changes were not obvious in the moment. They were, however, already being sketched on the margins of lists and notes in the hands of officers who understood that an isolated infraction could expose systemic vulnerabilities. What the men at the center of this story did not yet know was how the balance would be struck. Would the command pursue the most severe public sanction, thereby making a spectacle of discipline? Would it choose dismissal and transfer, an erasure of the man from day-to-day life, but also a potential avoidance of structural reform? Or would it opt for a hybrid course, one that combined clear individual accountability with procedural changes designed to prevent recurrence? The answer would emerge from the board's deliberations, where testimony, prior record, nurses' notes, and the necessities of war would all be weighed. For now, the knot had been tied but not cut. The unit had moved from shock to procedure, from confusion to inquiry. The woman remained a person under care. The soldier remained under guard. Leadership remained bound to decide. The drama was not in a dramatic courtroom, but in the quieter, more consequential calculus of a field board deciding whether discipline could be both firm and reformative. How that calculus resolved itself would be the twist that, for many observers, would later feel unexpected, an institution choosing to punish and to learn rather than to bury or to excommunicate without change. The morning promised a meeting that would set the trajectory for both men and for a unit's standards. The tent that would host the board stood in the pale light, its canvas billowing slightly in the tropical breeze. Officers gathered, pens poised, statements spread before them like a map. Outside, the world of war resumed. The roll call, the whispering repairs of equipment, the distant boom of artillery, reminding everyone that life here was still hazardous and relentless. Inside that tent, however, something different would be attempted. Not the headline justice of a courtroom drama, nor the silent passage of a covered scandal, but a judgment shaped by the rough logic of command and the sharper logic of conscience. It was, in other words, the kind of moral crucible that wartime institutions must occasionally pass through, small, painful, and capable of leaving a useful scar. If this kind of history speaks to you, consider subscribing. There's more careful, source-backed storytelling like this in the channel. The board met as the island exhaled another humid day. Inside the flap of the tent, the air tasted of tobacco and ink. Witness statements lay in ordered piles, each page a small, deliberate map of a few seconds that had altered lives and policy.
Officers read aloud and paused. A medic described the prisoner's condition with the clinical restraint of someone who had seen too much to dramatize it. A sergeant recounted what he had observed while on patrol. The soldier stood where he had been placed, under guard, eyes fixed at times on his boots, at times drifting toward the seam of canvas that let in the bright tropical light. He had acknowledged the action in an earlier interview. Now the question was not simply whether he had acted, but how the institution should respond. The board's deliberations were not theatrical. They were exhaustive in the way that necessity makes people careful. Lists of facts, cross-checks of times, corroboration of witnesses, and a sober weighing of the man's prior record. The same procedural caution that guided casualty reports now guided moral judgment. The officers asked whether there had been intent to harm, whether the woman had been physically injured beyond distress, whether the soldier's prior conduct showed a pattern, and whether his admission was complete and honest. They considered the likely effects of different punishments on unit cohesion and on the message to other soldiers responsible for prisoners' safety. Several factors bore heavy on the recommendation. First, the evidence was consistent that the woman had been vulnerable and frightened. Medics saw signs of acute stress and noted her need for privacy and protection. Second, multiple witnesses described an intrusive act that violated custodial trust, and the soldier had admitted the action in a direct interview. Third, there was no documented history of prior similar misconduct. The soldier's service record included commendations for bravery and steady conduct. Fourth, the exigencies of a forward theater meant that long logistical trials were both impractical and potentially demoralizing for men already stretched thin. Those realities did not create a neutral space. They forced a choice. The board could recommend a formal court-martial with the attendant time, publicity, and resources it would require. That option would satisfy those who believed that severe offenses demanded public legal reckoning, but it also risked a drawn-out process that could distract from operational needs and deepen rifts among the men. Alternatively, the board could recommend administrative discipline, reprimand, temporary confinement, reduction in rank, and immediate corrective measures to the unit's procedures for handling female detainees. The latter approach promised swifter implementation and a direct path to prevention through training and rule changes. After hours of deliberation, the tent's flaps sometimes letting in a breeze that smelt faintly of salt and grease, the board produced a recommendation that reflected the theater's practical and ethical calculus.
The recommendation, recorded in the field minutes, made clear findings: that the soldier's action had constituted a breach of custodial duty, that the captive's vulnerability required protective and medical responses, and that the soldier's prior service record was relevant in assessing mitigation but not in absolving responsibility. The board recommended administrative punishment rather than court-martial, an official reprimand, a period of temporary confinement in a theater detention facility, and reduction in rank. It also called for immediate procedural reforms: paired guard assignments for female detainees, stricter rotation schedules to prevent prolonged exposure to combat fatigue, and mandatory briefings for personnel assigned to custodial duties, emphasizing both the legal obligations and the moral responsibilities toward prisoners. The command accepted the board's recommendation. The language in the command note was deliberately sober: measured discipline to hold the man accountable and parallel reforms to prevent recurrence. The punishment would be formalized in a theater-level administrative action. The reforms would be distributed as guidance in division memos and as directives for immediate implementation where practicable. In some specifics, the records are in defino. The exact composition of the document chain and the names of certain legal advisors are not preserved in the surviving notes. What is clear is the result: no full court-martial in the recorded files for this incident, but a set of administrative punishments and a package of reforms pushed into action in the field. For the soldier, the consequences were immediate and tangible. He was issued a formal reprimand, his rank was reduced, and he was held in temporary confinement for a defined period. His equipment and authority were withdrawn while he awaited the formal administrative action. The punishment, written into the unit's logs, carried both practical and reputational effects. Within the close social world of a fighting unit, a reduction in rank reverberated. It altered how a man moved among his peers and changed the calculus of authority on future patrols. Men who had once relied on him now saw him differently. Some offered subdued support, others distance. The record preserves no neat reconciliation of those reactions, only a landscape of complicated human interactions. For the prisoner, the immediate priority remained medical and psychological care. Nurses and medics documented her transfer to a more secure infirmary and, where possible, arranged for female medical staff to attend to her. The field surgeon's notes emphasized careful observation and the need to remove her from any further exposure to the soldiers who had witnessed the incident. In a theater where resources were thin, these steps were nonetheless significant. They demonstrated that the command acknowledged its protective obligations and that it would act to secure the welfare of captives under American supervision. The unit implemented the recommended reforms with a mixture of administrative speed and practical improvisation. Paired guard assignments were instituted for detainees whose gender or vulnerability suggested additional risk. Rotation orders were adjusted to limit continuous assignment to custodial duties.
And junior officers received briefings stressing the gravity of custodial responsibilities. The division's administrative staff drafted clearer instructions on the handling of female prisoners, and the adjutant's files show language being circulated to subordinate units, emphasis on safeguarding dignity, on immediate medical assessment, and on mandatory reporting of any boundary breach. These changes were not a cure-all. In a forward area, enforcement could be uneven. Yet, they represented a shift from ad hoc management toward a doctrine that recognized both moral and operational necessity. The reaction within the unit mirrored the complexity of the board's recommendation. Some soldiers, relieved at the clarity of action, saw the disciplinary measures as necessary to preserve the unit's honor and the integrity of command. Others, who had admired the soldiers' prior leadership, felt the punishment disproportionate. Their discomfort was not a denial of wrongdoing so much as a wrestling with the more general problem of how to evaluate courage and failure in a single human ledger. What stood out in post-war recollections and in letters exchanged among veterans was not unanimity but deliberation, men re-examining the balance between battlefield performance and custodial standards, and grappling with the ways that extended combat could erode lines once taken for granted. Outside the immediate unit, the incident and its handling produced administrative reverberations. Division headquarters logged the case and its outcome. Staff officers incorporated the lessons into recommendations sent up the chain. The changes advocated on the island, paired guardianship, rotations, and targeted briefings, began to appear in revised guidance circulated beyond the unit, albeit with the usual theater lag that marked wartime administration. This diffusion of practice is one reason historians viewing the case later have pointed to it as an example of responsive adaptation, an isolated incident prompting procedural change that aimed to prevent similar breaches in future operations. That response is the kernel of the twist that shapes this story. It is tempting, when faced with wartime misconduct, to expect extremes, either a public punitive spectacle designed to make an example in the short term, or a hushed cover-up intended to preserve effective fighters.
Neither of those extremes aligns with what the documentary record shows in this case. The recorded decision combined clear personal accountability with an institutional willingness to learn and to adapt. The Army administered discipline that acknowledged the seriousness of the breach and, at the same time, instituted reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses. The twist, the unexpectedness to contemporary observers, is that the institution shows both correction and reform, not simply one over the other. This administrative path had consequences. It sent a message to men in the field that custodial duty carried enforceable responsibilities even under strain. It offered the prisoner tangible protections and medical attention. It allowed the command to maintain operational focus while signaling that certain lines must not be crossed. In the long view, the case became a modest but real precedent for how forward units might address similar breaches, not by silence nor by theatrical destruction, but by calibrated discipline tied to structural prevention. Those outcomes did not erase the moral cost. The woman carried trauma from the incident. The record implies she remained under observation until it was operationally possible to transfer her to a safer, more permanent facility. Her experience underscores a constant truth about wartime custody. Vulnerability demands vigilance, and lapses carry lasting human effects that official forms and memos cannot fully measure. For the soldier, the administrative punishment altered his path in the theater. The reduction in rank and the stigma in his unit were penalties with both practical and psychological weight. The record does not follow his life beyond the field files. Any later fate is indefinito. The documents we have end with the formal disposition in theater and with the implementation of procedural reforms. The incident's ripple effects emerged not only in practical policy, but also in memory. Years later, memoirs and veteran accounts that touched on the episode vary in tone. Some recollections emphasize the necessity of discipline and the pride felt by those who saw rules maintained. Others focus on the sadness of a man's fall from peer esteem and on the fragile human limits that prolonged combat exposed.
Scholars who later analyzed administrative memos and field reports pointed to this case as illustrative of a broader pattern. Battlefield administrations that combined accountability with incremental reform could preserve unit effectiveness while affirming standards of humane conduct. The case is, in other words, both an ethical test and an institutional lesson. Historians have debated the optimal balance between criminal prosecution and administrative punishment in forward theaters. Court-martials, where feasible, offer formal legal adjudication and can produce precedent in a courtroom record.
Administrative actions, conversely, provide speed and immediate operational clarity and can be coupled with reforms that address root causes. In this instance, the board and command judged that administrative measures, backed by a clear record of findings and by prompt policy changes, best served the twin aims of justice and military necessity. That judgment is open to ethical scrutiny. Some will argue that only a court of law can properly reconcile individual guilt and communal harm. But the documents suggest commanders believed that swift, transparent administrative action would both punish and prevent in ways that a lengthy trial could not in the circumstances then present. The cultural elements of the episode are also important. The presence of a female prisoner was rare enough in that theater to create a kind of cognitive dissonance among troops. Many soldiers had been conditioned to engage primarily with male opponents, and the social codes around gendered bodies in combat zones were imperfectly adapted in the chaos of island fighting. Moreover, cultural attitudes among Japanese captives about surrender, shaped by shame and fear, meant that any female detainee was often in an acute psychological state. The overlapping pressures of cross-cultural misunderstanding, combat fatigue, and rigid hierarchies created a fraught environment in which a single intrusive action could do outsized harm. The reforms the unit adopted acknowledged this complexity by addressing both human factors, rotation, supervision, and procedural clarity, guard pairing, mandatory reporting. The medic's notebooks and the nurse's notes in the surviving archive offer a quiet, humane counterpoint to the administrative pages. Nurses recorded small practical instructions: ensure privacy, limit exposure to male personnel who had witnessed the incident, provide supportive care. Those entries, spare and professional, reveal the way immediate caregiving can shape outcomes and mitigate harm. They also highlight the role medical staff played in the board's deliberations. Clinical testimony grounded the ethical assessment in observable effects on the captive, shifting the debate from abstract culpability to tangible harm and remedial need. The men who served with the soldier reconstructed the event for decades in letters and memoir fragments that surfaced after the war. Those accounts do not produce a unanimous storyline. They produce a human chorus of contradiction and sympathy. Some writers insisted the soldier's lapse was unforgivable and that the military's punishment was insufficient. Others, who admired his earlier actions, lamented his public fall while acknowledging the necessity of consequences. Those divided memories mirror the ethical tension inherent in any wartime judgment, the push and pull between the valorization of battlefield competence and the uncompromising moral obligations of custodial duty.
Institutional archives suggest that the procedural changes inspired by this incident were not limited to a single unit. Division-level staff compiled recommendations and circulated them in as much detail as wartime communication allowed. Manuals and training materials revised in subsequent months echoed themes from the event. Explicit emphasis on the protection of vulnerable detainees, clearer reporting channels for custodial breaches, and practical guidance on assignments that might expose single soldiers to prolonged custodial stress. In bureaucratic terms, the incident contributed to a slow accretion of policy that, while not revolutionary, strengthened the institutional scaffolding around prisoner handling. The story's greater implication is about the moral mechanics of military institutions in extremity. War compresses ethical choices into moments where human frailty and institutional standards collide. The case examined here offers one model of resolution: an institution that recognizes wrongdoing, disciplines the offender, protects the victim, and uses the episode to reduce future risk.
That model is neither perfect nor universally applicable, but it matters precisely because it refuses the easy options of artful silence or simple spectacle. In the cramped calculus of a forward theater, the command's choice to combine discipline with reform reflected an operational ethic. That humane treatment is not merely sentimental but strategic, and that maintaining moral standards sustains cohesion and legitimacy. The twist, the unexpected center of the narrative, is not sensational. It is procedural and moral at once. The army did not hide the event under the rug, nor did it attempt to redeem the soldier with uncritical praise. It faced the incident directly, imposed a tangible penalty that fit the evidence and the practical needs of the theater, and then moved to translate the lesson into organizational change. That response, recorded in field minutes and subsequent memos, has a quieter drama than a courtroom drama would have offered. It shows an institution capable of recognizing failure, applying measured sanction, and reframing operations to reduce the likelihood of recurrence. In the end, the case left marks that were both administrative and human. The soldier returned to the ranks in a diminished capacity once his formal period of confinement and discipline concluded. How he lived with the consequences is left to indefinito in the files. The prisoner's immediate needs were addressed, and, where possible, she was transferred to a more secure facility. The surviving medical notes suggest continued observation and an effort to preserve her dignity. The unit implemented the reforms, and those procedural changes filtered into broader practice, influencing how other formations thought about custodial duty under stress. The lesson that emerges from this event is neither triumphalist nor despairing.
It is a reminder of the fragile ethical bonds that order military life, and of the way institutions must sometimes answer not just to law, but to conscience. A few seconds of transgression exposed vulnerabilities in a system and, crucially, produced corrective action. That corrective action was not merely punitive, it was preventive, designed to harden institutional protections around the most vulnerable in custody. For historians, and for those who study military ethics, the case underscores the importance of systems that can both punish and learn. It shows that accountability need not always be a public agony. In some contexts, swift administrative measures combined with structural reforms can achieve justice and enhance protection. At the same time, the story warns us that administrative resolution should never be a cover for evasion. The legitimacy of such a path rests on transparency, promptness, and a sincere commitment to preventing recurrence, standards that, in this instance, the command strove to meet. The small tent where men deliberated in the pre-dawn hours became a kind of crucible in miniature. It was the place where a fighting force called itself to account, measured consequence against practicality, and then translated judgment into policy. The human scars remained: a woman's trauma, a soldier's diminished status, a unit's shaken certainties. The institutional lessons endured: clearer rules, paired guardianship, rotation and training adjustments, and an administrative acknowledgement that custodial duty is a moral and operational priority. History often compresses nuance into headlines. In this episode, the more instructive truth is granular and quiet. The incident did not lead to an explosive public reckoning. It did not vanish under a tide of silence. Instead, a measured chain of command response imposed punishment and enacted reform. That combination, discipline married to systemic change, is the twist that reorients our expectations. It is, perhaps, less dramatic than a courtroom drama, but more consequential for the men and the policy that followed. When we weigh this story, we must hold several truths together. We must acknowledge the harm done to a vulnerable captive, and affirm that such breaches of custodial trust demand accountability. We must also consider the operational realities commanders faced, and the ways institutional choices can seek to balance justice, morale, and future risk reduction. Recognizing the soldier's prior service is not excusing his act. It is situating a human failure in the messy arithmetic of war. Recognizing the administrative remedy is not diminishing the need for legal clarity in appropriate cases.
It is noting the path chosen under the constraints of a forward theater and the reforms that followed. The tent folded its decisions into the field's records. Men returned to their tasks and to the uneasy work of living with the aftermath.
The division staff circulated memos. Training was adjusted. Medics and nurses continued to press for privacy and care. Those small bureaucratic moves added up into a larger shift, a theater more attentive, in practice and policy, to the risks female detainees faced and to the ways combat stress could erode boundaries. Small reforms in procedure do not erase human suffering, but they can reduce the likelihood of its repetition. This is the untold story not because the events were secret, but because its import is quieter than scandal and subtler than redemption. It is untold in part because it forces us to consider an uncomfortable conclusion. Moral failure can occur in capable troops under strain, and institutions must be both willing to hold individuals accountable and willing to change the structures that permit such failures. The twist lies in the institution's decision to do both. From the field's cramped tents to the administrative files that perpetuated new guidance, the response measured justice and turned it into prevention. If you found this account thought-provoking, leave a comment below with your reflections on wartime ethics and institutional responsibility. Sources and notes for this episode, including references to field reports, after-action reviews, and division memos indicated in the primary records, are linked in the description. Where document identifiers are not preserved in the surviving archive, they are listed as indefinito.